So today at the REST-ID seminar, we have Edward Nik-Khah, who will be talking about economists becoming experts, epistemologists for platform capitalism. And our discussant today is Béatrice Cherrier. This seminar is a part of our RESTS project. The project is funded by the Finnish Cultural Foundation, and it is the public phase of our research project called Economics as Serviceable Social Knowledge, which is funded by the Academy of Finland. Our main speaker today is Edward Nik-Khah. He is a professor of economics at Roanoke College. He is the co-author of the Knowledge We Have Lost in Information, written with Philip Morosky, and Markets, written with Armin Beverung, Philip Morosky, and Jens Schroeter. His research interests span over a wide variety of topics, including history of information, political economy of science, neoliberalism, market design, and the participation of economists in design and deployment of governance by algorithm. And our discussant, Béatrice Cherrier, is an associate professor at CNRS and CREST at Ecole Polytechnique. And she's a historian of economics who studies history of the applied turn in economics, development of economics in engineering-oriented universities, status of women in the economics profession, uses of models in policy spheres, epistemologies and computational practices developed in the subfields of economics. So it's our pleasure today to have both Edward and Béatrice. And without taking much of your time, I will just give the floor to Edward, Eddie, and start the show. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emrah. It's really my great pleasure. Thank you so much for extending the invitation to do this. Looking forward to the discussion. Okay, there we are. So in 2016, a Bloomberg headline announced that the world's top economists want to work for Amazon and Facebook. And today, economics professors hold joint appointments with such firms. They routinely perform contact research for them. They've accepted full-time positions, and some of the most prestigious economists are among their ranks. So in 2015, the AEA named as its distinguished fellow the chief economist at Google. The 2007 Clark medalist served as chief economist for Microsoft, along with a bunch of other tech firms. And graduate students have followed their mentors' examples. So Amazon reportedly employs more economists than even the largest economics departments. They created new conferences. In 2017, Amazon, Google, and IBM, Intel, and Zillow partnered with the National Association of Business Economists to organize an annual conference entitled Tech Economics, Economics in the Age of Algorithms, Experiments in AI. And if you've ever heard this term tech economist, this is basically where the term came from. Research sponsored by these firms appear within the field's top journals. Academic programs devote their curricula to making economics students more marketable to such firms. And this is true not only at the graduate level, but it's also true down to undergraduate principals. The AEA celebrates the mutual influence between economics and the tech sector. So today I want to talk about influence. I mean, on the one hand, economists speak as if this work opens up new avenues for studying classic economic questions. So in an interview posted to his Freakonomics blog, Stephen Levitt expressed joy at Uber offering him a chance to, quote, hold a demand curve in my own hands. The title of the post was Why Uber is an Economist's Dream. From this perspective, computerization and digitization allowed for the collection of data unavailable before to the economists. At the same time, tech economists often departed sharply from previous research programs in economics. So take Alvin Roth, for example. He proclaimed that, quote, successful designs depend greatly on the details of the market, including the culture and psychology of the participants. I am personally unaware of an economist advising a student to skip that additional course in game theory and pick one up in ethnography or anthropology and revise their modeling strategy accordingly. And so, at the outset, I just want to say that something else seems to be going on with the tech economists here. And it does have something to do with the computer, but just what can only be seen as part of a longer history. I'm going to contend that this tech economist is the newest chapter in economists' ongoing engagement with information processing. And this dates back to the immediate post-war era. Addressing information would bring economists to study and ultimately to engineer markets. And allying with the tech firm would pave the way for them to participate in the design of ever-expanding roster of domains of modern social life. So first, let's do a bit of the history. Cherrier once made this point that the computer was never merely a device to utilize, it was also one to think with. And so if we fail to recognize her point, that may lead to a misapprehension of the most significant consequences of computerization in economics. So how have economists thought with the computer? There are several histories of social science during the Cold War that may help us along the right path. And here I'm thinking of authors such as Paul Edwards and Hunter Heck, Paul Erickson, Judy Klein, and a number of others. And they inform us that in the decades following World War II, encouraged by military patronage, that human reasoning was conflated with the computer. And this drove the formation of new academic specialties, such as cybernetics and artificial intelligence, and especially operations research. It also took hold within existing ones, including anthropology, political science, and philosophy. And for those seeking to examine society, it shifted focus. It shifted focus from the chooser to the choice, from people and their context and mental states to study of the decision. It would blur the boundaries between human and machine. It would encourage a mindset where the human element was regarded as unreliable. And this set up a problem. The problem of how to smoothly integrate humans within the loop. So economists were hardly exempt from these same trends. Information represented everything that was new and pregnant with possibility in the post-war social sciences, really across the sciences. And so here I'm going to draw from work with Philip Murawski on in our jointly authored book. And just briefly, I want to talk about what was different about economics. They required a bit more provocation to respond to these big trends. And that provocation came in the form of the socialist calculation controversy. So you'll all know that during the interwar period, Austrians such as Friedrich Hayek kicked off the controversy with an argument that government planners could never know enough to adequately plan any reasonably elaborate economic system. Now, several economists took Hayek's argument as a direct challenge to their scientific ambitions. There's a lot to this history, but for us, the important point is these disputes got sidetracked into considerations about what it meant for markets to convey information to the relevant actors. And so by the 1940s, the neoliberal portion of the argument was being promoted by international members of the Mont Pelerin Society, whereas their opponents were primarily located at the Coles Commission. By the 1950s, during the 1950s, Leonid Hurwicz and his colleagues at Ecole started responding to Hayek's provocations by reconceiving their task as economists. Now they claimed that they could use their methods to evaluate the informational properties of economic systems. They would claim that these methods would enable them to be able to choose between a plethora of institutions. And they subsequently rebranded themselves as experts in organization. They began to contemplate designing new institutions. These range from novel legal regimes to solutions for public goods provision to the reorganization of entire economies. But what's most significant for the historical development of economics is that they would eventually claim an ability to reconstruct individual markets themselves. Okay, now at this time, lots of other social theorists are studying organizations, but this group was distinct. And what was distinct about them is that they tend to ignore organizations, but instead theorize different markets. Now that might seem strange, but as it turns out, over time, cultural and politically, all organizations would be increasingly reconceptualized as markets. And this had a lot to do with the world becoming more neoliberal politically and culturally at this time. So this lent the project some legitimacy, and it allowed it to sort of continue. Okay, so market design was in an important respect an expression of this focus on the decision. Now, I'll acknowledge that this might seem like a kind of an odd claim to make. After all, didn't market design emerge from game theory? After all, this is what Alvin Roth and Robert Wilson claimed. And isn't game theory about agents? But I would say that this is mistaken historically in at least two different ways. A first has to do with the impression that game theory got there first. But in fact, a different group of economists offered to construct markets first, and that was a group of experimental economists. This was partly due to their avid support for deregulation, and it was also partly due to their previous interaction with the physical computer in the setup of experiments. Now, this is important to grasp because experimental economists had a different understanding of agency than game theorists did. They had little use for game theory staples such as incentive compatibility. Instead, they would argue that knowledge about the economy would come from the operation of the market, the most powerful information processor known to humankind. Vernon Smith would repeatedly cite Hayek in support, as is evident from the quote that I provided on this slide. They viewed markets as, quote, person-machine systems. Agents might be involved in some way in their operation, but the responsibility for the thinking that was done would be offloaded more or less onto the machine components of this system. The term that they used for this was smart markets, and it's really an apt term. Now, initially, game theorists didn't care much for this move. They insisted that these smart markets lacked theoretical grounding, and so they couldn't be recommended for adoption. Now, you might think that experimentalists would respond to this criticism by tweaking their models of individual agency. But here's what's fascinating about the history. Over time, it was really the game theorists that came around. And there's a way you can trace this change. So if you go back to the 1990s, they argued against the use of smart markets in the sale of public assets, full stop. But by the time of the 2017 FCC incentive auctions, they argued in favor of them. They would acknowledge the, quote, absence of any deep theoretical treatment for their proposals. Here I'm quoting Paul Milgram. They began to relinquish their commitment to individual rationality. and they would begin attributing immense ability of price discovery to their carefully crafted institutions. They really start to sound a lot like their former antagonists, the experimentalists. And now game theorists too would offer computerized person-machine systems to produce reason, if I'm going to take Hunter Heck's term. During the Cold War, to say a Vannevar Bush, that would have involved enlisting the population in a rationalized total war effort. But now it involves substituting market-like devices for a widening variety of processes that previously depended on human judgment. So here I want to offer my first observation concerning computerization. Before, economists wishing to engage with the computer would have allied with the military, and this would lead them to focus on the decision, much like others. But as the military support dwindled, economists wishing to work with the computer would have to find another ally. Okay, so everyone knows about the sale of public assets and everyone still talks about it, and that was important. It was only after the FCC auctions in the United States that economists were able to position themselves as experts in computerized market construction. But today, however, the best place to observe market design in action isn't where public assets are occasionally sold. Susan Athey has noted, quote, "The most recent new wave of auction design has been coming from large firms in the private sector, such as Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo." Preston McAfee has described his work for Yahoo as, quote, "the next frontier in the application of market design to the real world." Both were premier market designers, and so they were well positioned to make this observation. And both were previously involved in the sale of public assets. Both subsequently went to work for these tech firms. So let's follow them over there. But we need to take care because it's kind of easy to lose the trail. One recent review of market design claims that online markets, quote, "evolved from simple auction platforms such as eBay to large-scale sponsored search auctions to the sophisticated real-time pricing and matching infrastructure used in the sharing economy." But this isn't quite how it played out in the history. Once upon a time, say around 2000, all agreed that network computerization would revolutionize a new market order. So there was this widely circulated Wired article published that year, which hailed, quote, "an economic revolution that would usher in 24/7 global marketplace of true fluid markets, real dynamic pricing, and kick-ass shop bots." One of the major people interviewed for the piece was Charles Plott, the experimental economist. Less than a decade later, James Surowiecki would pose the question, also in Wired, who killed the internet auction? And you have this curious thing where by that time, old-fashioned posted price markets had overtaken auctions on eBay in terms of transaction volume. So instead, the most significant internet businesses to enlist market designers were digital companies seeking to monetize search. I know that I'm passing over this history of business-to-business commerce, and I just have to acknowledge that and move on to talk about Google and the monetization of search. And Google was there first. So Eric Schmidt approached Halvarian in 2002 and Berkeley. In 2007, Microsoft brought Susan Athey on board to examine its Bing auctions. And that same year, Yahoo hired Preston McAfee. There are many other digital firms that very soon followed suit. Interestingly, those that were seemingly positioned to deploy novel forms of exchange, such as eBay, were very late to the party. The impression quickly took hold that game theory was instructing the design of the digital economy. So Susan Athey wrote, we want to get out and actually use the tools of economics to make markets work better. She attributed these tools to, quote, Bob Wilson's pioneering work in auctions in the 1960s. The rise of economists and tech companies has coincided with the rise of market design. But as we've seen, their main occupation really wasn't to unleash a bunch of souped up eBay-style auctions across the internet. So what exactly were these designers doing? In order to find out, we have to take a closer look at the business models of the tech companies that hired them. Not long ago, economists and other observers praised Google for its search capabilities, email services, cloud storage, and for giving it all away for free. Since then, there's arisen a robust literature on platform capitalism, which has arrived at a more mature understanding of the business model of Google and other similar businesses. So I've just indicated two sources that I think are pretty good for reading about this. The platform seeks data. It gets so by positioning itself as a digital intermediary, and it charges a low price because it wants to encourage people to use the service. And this enables the firm to collect more data. From this data, it can compile private databases, it can train artificial intelligence, and it can utilize this artificial intelligence for the purposes of developing critical organizational and decision-making infrastructure. They don't merely take a cut from facilitating complex exchanges. Their goal was to position themselves between participants as a monopolistic owner of vital infrastructure and a gatekeeper of the knowledge to operate it. So the first place where these various elaborate auction forms found consistent use was advertising within the platform firm. So let's take a closer look at these auctions. The advertiser, who is the bidder, must identify several characteristics of what it is that they hope to acquire. And actually, several really isn't the right word because it doesn't capture the immensity of the task. There are potentially trillions of different ad types. The host of the auction must sort through all these characteristics somehow. So if we're talking about banner ads, which is just one type of ad, that sorting must transpire in the time that it takes to load a website. So it has to take place pretty quickly. There's much more to it than this, as advertising takes place within a larger ad tech stack comprised of several elements ranging from auctions, from auction hosting, to shop bots, to purportedly neutral marketplaces. I say purportedly neutral marketplaces because in recent years, the structuring of these marketplaces has aroused considerable interest by antitrust authorities. Okay, now I want to return to Athey's link of tech economics to Robert Wilson's work in market design. And here, I have to apologize because just for a bit, I have to get into the weeds. So there are two real-world problems that are most directly associated with Wilson's work and the tradition spawned by it. That would have to do with truthful revelation, and especially if we're talking about Robert Wilson, learning. Okay, so first, truthful revelation. That has to do with structuring incentives so participants would reveal their true private values. So in this literature, that is the thing that goes by the name incentive compatibility. Okay, that's one. Second is learning. And learning has to do with structuring an auction to release information in order to help participants infer a true value they didn't know. In the literature, that goes by the name avoiding the winner's curse. So to model auctions, tech economists usually begin by considering one specific aspect of the strategic situation confronting a bidder within a very narrow part of that larger ad tech stack. These models address how to bid on an advertisement slot given the bidder's private values for it. Now, at first glance, this seems like exactly the kind of thing that game theory is built for. So Google's auction was deemed to be something called a generalized second price auction, referencing the auction form made famous by William Vickray's famous analysis. But Google also employed a special scoring system in ranking bids. So the outcome of the auction didn't depend solely on the bids, as in the other cases of design, but additionally on a quality score. This score was determined in an unspecified way by click-through rates, relevancy, landing page quality, and a whole bunch of other undisclosed factors. Now, not only did this complicate the strategic circumstance, but it also amounted to an acknowledgement that bidders may be wrong about their values. So this involved casting aside the rationale for employing a second price auction in the first place. I mean, if one didn't believe that bidders knew their values, then gathering them would be of no help for the auction's operation, because, I mean, so to speak, they didn't have any truth to tell. Now, of course, game theorists had previously dealt with this situation. This was the very point of studying the winner's curse. So classically with the winner's curse, the English auction would enable bidders to observe actions of other participants. So we're talking about an open auction where it was possible to observe when bidders dropped out. Now here I'm talking about a textbook case of studying the winner's curse, okay? And in that textbook case, bidders would retabulate their valuations during the auction and ultimately learn the objective value of the item for sale. So tech economists praise platforms for collecting information pertaining to the true value of an ad slot. Anything could potentially pertain to this value. Age of the browser, marital status, income, past browsing activity, the weather. So these techniques for solving the winner's curse were presented as holding out the promise of making firms' marketing decisions more scientific. But it also became a justification for the collection of potentially limitless amounts of data. And when considered within this larger ad tech stack, the platform could potentially improve such knowledge by obligating websites and apps to install tracking software as a condition for accessing its ad network. So in contrast to the auctions studied within the Bayes-Nash tradition, of which Wilson was one of the most important figures, the relevant knowledge on which the system ran came not from participants within the auction. It came from the unbounded surveillance of people outside the confines of the auction. And what was once attributed to agents learning from the information that had been publicized within the confines of the auction would now be addressed by machine learning, which market designers would now claim would solve the winner's curse instead of the participants. Okay, so we come a long way. I think it's clear from markets apparently reflecting the preferences of agents, because now agents are deemed incapable of undertaking cognitive tasks, but suitably engineered markets could. Now, once we realize that this is the viewpoint, there's some curious things that start to make some sense. So if we look at Yahoo Research, the team that they assembled in market design, They formed a team to bring together cognitive scientists, sociologists, economists, ethnographers, and computer scientists. Now, Preston McAfee explained to the shareholders of Yahoo that, quote, market design uses four main tools. We use economic theory, we use experiments, and we use a bit of psychology and sociology to figure out how to get people to interact either online or offline in a productive and useful fashion. So I would note that this seems like a pretty strange turn, because less than a decade before, one often encountered claims that all social science worth its salt must be reducible to game theory. And market design was commonly cited as evidence for why this must be so. Yet market designers now appear to embrace a more cosmopolitan vision. But I would submit that these weren't really calls to develop enriched theories of individual agency in conversation with previously antagonistic disciplines. Instead, they're better thought of as an expression of concerns similar to those previously voiced by predecessors in operations research. And so on this note, Alvin Roth is abundantly clear. Quote, if you really want to operate at digital speeds, you need to take people out of the process. And of course, Alvin Roth's training was in operations research. So activities initially portrayed as crafting incentives became tasks in information processing. Now, economists who accepted this revised rationale for their participation found novel ways to do so across a range of digital firms. Some of these activities, such as the structuring of digital reputational mechanisms, bore little obvious resemblance to work previously performed by economists. So consequently, tech economists continued in their departure from previous ways of theorizing markets. So I have a quote. It's a little bit longish, and I'm sorry for that. But the thing is, there are interesting bits in this quote that we need to talk about. So I'll just read through it. In economic theory, the canonical pricing problem involves a seller with several potential buyers, each of whom privately knows his or her willingness to pay. We talked about this before. Auctions tend to be the optimal mechanism to ensure an efficient allocation or to maximize revenue while maintaining proper incentives for buyers. But in practice, it can be cumbersome to identify potential bidders and sellers and elicit information from them. As a result, simpler pricing mechanisms can make sense if information is available from other sources, or if there is not too much uncertainty about what is the right price. Okay, so things to talk about. First, let's talk about the reference to right price. But what was the criterion now for right price? For the canonical pricing problem mentioned, the answer was clear enough. It would reflect the information possessed by agents. And so then getting markets to operate correctly would require crafting incentives in order to get at that information that they possessed. But the language of how cumbersome it may be in practice to use such an auction really amounted to a rejection of understanding markets as employing proper incentives. Proper incentives to get at a knowledge that agents weren't assumed to possess anymore. Fortunately, one could discover the necessary information in other ways. Some suggested using behavioral techniques or gamification as a substitute for material incentives. Others, such as Stephen Tadelis, proposed that platforms should take what he called a regulator-like approach that, quote, does not assume that market participants can decipher information effectively. Referencing eBay, he offered an example of this sort of regulation. Platforms could infer the quality of sellers from the text of messages sent between them. This resulting market could utilize machine learning in the form of text mining and natural language processing to rank sellers. And perhaps it would even manipulate the set of sellers that the buyer sees. Okay, so earlier I argued that economists were caught up in some big trends. So now I'd like to kind of get out of the weeds a little bit, pan out, and I want to highlight some of these bigger trends. So the first has to do with information processing. The key feature of post-war economics was the necessity to grapple with information. And this was not merely another topic within economics, such as, say, the textbook treatment of externalities. Instead, by grappling with information, it would inaugurate a wholesale change in economists' understanding of what the economy is. No longer would markets be portrayed as generic mechanical devices for allocating goods according to relative need. And instead, they'd be viewed as devices for producing and conveying information. This was a profound rupture, the importance of which it is very difficult to overstate. However, information changed over time, and this was due to successive developments outside of economics. And so as a consequence, economists felt compelled to revise their understanding of what markets accomplished. And this is how we should understand that initial difference between game theorists and experimentalists on agency in markets. The second has to do with epistemology. So these seemingly technical matters of information brought about changes in what it meant to know something. And this was true both for the agents and for the economists portraying them. Economists would now deny that agents had unchallenged access to knowledge about the economy. Truth instead would come to be defined as the output of the market. And markets would come to be viewed as person-machine systems, and economists in turn would play a role in designing these aptly named smart markets. The third has to do with the assumption by the economists of a novel role. So as economists downgraded the importance of agent cognition, they revised their understanding of their own place within the larger scheme of things. Rather than counseling how to give people what it is that they supposedly want, now economists would construct markets that should operate regardless of what people think they want. And so while you often encounter statements to the effect that economists would want to make markets work better, this move of theirs would inadvertently undermine and dissolve the prior welfare economics that defined what better meant. If people didn't know what they wanted, then to what extent could it be said that any entity might provide it? As a consequence, it rejected the notion that there was a standard generic market to give people what it is that they wanted. Now, you don't have to take my word for it, okay? I would offer the words of Eric Posner and Glenn Weil. So this was taken from their widely read book, Radical Markets. Suppose that it were possible, based on the tracking of the movements of the eyes of a viewer, for an algorithm to determine which parts of a movie appeal to him and in what ways. Technologies like this are, in fact, already in use for marketing purposes. In this scenario, choice seems like a metaphor rather than a phenomenologically accurate term for the relevant behavior. So this brings us back to the platform. It's important to note that Posner and Weil were referring explicitly to the operation of platform firms in this passage. It was part of a larger discussion about the operation of platform firms. Now, platforms encourage research on various aspects of information processing. Okay, and those big trends that we talked about within the profession conditioned economists to accept that encouragement. So economists moved further away from the study of individual rationality, denying that agents had unchallenged access to knowledge about the economy. Additionally, they would theorize and participate in the surveillance of people outside the confines of what would previously have been understood as the mechanism. That Posner and Weil's observation was offered in a chapter entitled After Markets gives us some sense of the tensions involved for economists conceiving of person-machine systems hosted by platforms as markets. The agent's cognition would be degraded, while the very mechanism making the choice would be obscured. Now, navigating this rather treacherous terrain was nothing new for market designers. When they had previously addressed matters of public concern, such as in the sale of public assets, but not only, wavering between these different notions of markets had always been the price of admission. But in an era in which increasing swaths of life are mediated by the network computer, and network computing is organized by the platform firm, the contradiction evidently becomes more difficult to ignore. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie. This was wonderful. Many thanks. Now it's time for us to hear what Béatrice thinks about all this.
Okay. Eddie, can you put back your slides? And I want your slides with the quote on going back to simpler pricing mechanism, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so because I was supposed, so I actually messed up. I thought it would be an hour later and it's an hour earlier. So if it was in 2 hours, I would have slides, but I don't. So I'm gonna just reuse it. So if
Okay.
I
Wait a second, which slide was it? I'm sorry.
the slides on with the INAV quote.
Okay, sure.
So
Yep.
if I summarize, so you gave me a paper. So what I'm going to do here, so basically you're presenting research on a paper that you say you wrote because I provoked you to do so. Yep. I'm going to bring more provocation so that you write other papers, basically. So if I understand your timeline first correctly, you are moving quite fast from, so there was Cold War uses of computer. That's a research that's already been done. Your research with Phil is about reinvestigating how Hayek thought about markets and information processors. At a moment, the government needed to build market to allocate public goods. That's what you did. And in that paper, you actually go beyond that to sort of tell a story about what happened when business actually needed to build markets to allocate private goods. And you have that lines on, well, actually experimentalists get that first, but then game theorists. I'm going to come back to that. And so for a while, the job was to actually build a incentive mechanism to reveal information. But at some point, this business decided that it was easier to actually fish for the information elsewhere, right? So this is how I understand. And there is all this question about whether auctions have actually been killed that I find interesting. And you actually embed all this in a wider framework about how the history of economics in the last 70 years has not been so much about transforming rationality than replacing rationality. Okay, so that's, you can buy it or not, but that's how I would summarize what you just said. So I'm going to make 3 types of comments. So I'm going to leave, we already discussed for years the early history of market design and how we can interpret what Which was trying to do. We had a long discussion on Wilson. I'm not going to go back to that, though it's interesting. I'm going to focus on the really on the tech economist. So the most recent period, and I'm going to focus on the question of the role of economists, because you have a whole line of thinking about sort of platform capitalism. But in that most recent work, it's very much about the changing role of economists into that. And I'm going to try to make sense of your history with my own category, which are much simpler. So I'm going to ask 3 questions: what's new and what's not in your story? Then what you're describing changed the epistemology, tools, and identity of economists. And I'm going to go back to the role of computerization at the end, because our last round of discussion happened within bigger discussion on the role of computerization in economics at large. So first, basic questions of what's new, what's not. This is a story about the client as a military, to the client as a state, to the client as business. And so I'm going to ask more explicitly to you, so what does it change to you? How you can say change everything, but you can also say it changed nothing. Now we work with proprietary data, but we work with secrecy in the Cold War. There is interdisciplinary now. There was interdisciplinary back then. So does the client makes it different? Is it a story driven more by clients or by technology, for instance? And I ask this question because one very puzzling thing in the paper, also in the talk, is what's around here as the weird status of game theorists throughout your story. So you have a story that says, let's say, actually experimentalists got there first. Okay, fine. But then, game theorists got interested in that, and they proposed more and more sophisticated mechanisms, incentive compatibility and mechanisms to reveal informations and auctions. But if I read your story on a very basic level, they were just not really heard, right? So my question is actually your claim that business hired game theorists more specifically to play a status game. I can make a comparison with what many people, including I, have been doing on the history of central banks. There is one big question hanging in there, is that did central banks actually use the SGE models, or was it just kind of scientific signaling or stuff like that? So we've been studying that. And if you actually listen to sociologists of central banking, they're going to tell you, oh, wait, these new waves of models was not used in decision making as just prestige signaling. So, like, there is a whole literature on the scientization of central banks. So could there be a literature on the scientization of tech firms, and what would it look like? And if it's just a status game, what's the status game is played for? And in one question is it a game playing for regulators? Okay, what's the use of the status of the scientific status gained by hiring game theorists rather than just, for instance, experimentalists? So that would be one first set of questions. Now, on how all this changed like being hired by tech firms and becoming tech economists changed the history and epistemology and identity of economists. One of my problems is that you seem to be telling 2 stories here, because I have slightly different categories that you have. The main one is on building market. So it's a history of market designer, people who actually provide mechanism for auction, game theorists and experimentalists. These guys, they build algorithm, okay? And these are economists as market builders. But by the end of your story, it becomes a story about data and recovering data and what you do with big data. And it's a different story, all right? It's a story about the history of econometrics and going into AI and big data, and economist identity being reframed as causality specialist, right? And Galder's standard for identification and all that stuff, okay? And so it's different. And for instance, Susan Athey, which is one of your protagonists, she shows up in both stories, okay? She shows up in the tech economist, classical tech economist / market design kind of story, but more recently, she's also known for taming machine learning so that it fits into economist criteria for causal identification, okay? And that's the second story. So I was wondering how you actually, do you see a difference between the two stories or whether it's the same for you? I could even add two more stories. One story is about platform capitalism and regulation, and economists working on regulation. And the fourth story is basically about, is there any comparison or something that's borrowed for these economists who are using computer massively in finance for forecasting? You could say, okay, you don't want to incentivize behavior. You actually want to forecast behavior or forecast motives. So how does it work? I mean, is there any link with computerization in finance? And if I go to the most recent period, I mean, we are in the week when Sam Bankman-Fried is getting on trial. So I need to ask the question of the relationship with crypto. Okay, is it a story that fits into your bigger story, or is it different? Is it a story about market? Is it, I mean, you could tell it as a story where economists are conspicuously absent, so it would be different. So that's also one of my questions. And my last batch of questions is coming back to the role of computerization. And your claim, I mean, it's not your claim, but you talk about it, about the death of auction. So I find it very interesting, and I'm going to try to push you to think about more about this or write about more about this. And my question would be, is it the computer that precipitated the death of auction? Is it economists working for business that precipitated it? Or is it economists working with computer scientists? And when you think about this question, you actually think about new epistemologies. And this is your quote here. I mean, you're basically having a narrative arc in which experimentalists were doing dirty work and they were approximating mechanism, and approximation is important here, to that work being taken up by game theorists who were trying to find sort of cleaner mechanism. And the story you're telling is going back. I mean, in practice, it can be cumbersome to identify potential buyers and sellers. Simpler pricing mechanism can make sense, right? So going back to, in practice, going back to simpler mechanism because it's cumbersome. I mean, to me, it screams tractability, of course. One question I have is, do you see a displacement of epistemological criteria about tractability here? And so experimentalists doing dirty work, game theorists being concerned with like stable equilibrium and unique equilibrium, but then they have to work increasingly with computer scientists. Computer scientists ask questions about NP hardness and speed of calculation, and also about what happened when it's hard to actually find an equilibrium. And in my research, for instance, I'm trying to study the greater collaboration between market designers and computer scientists in the 2000 and 2010. And a lot of them talk about, I mean, taking on the work of Papadimitriou, for instance, on combinatorial optimization, and people at conference discussing stuff like, if the solution concept is here, and game theorists prove that it's here, but it's hard to compute, why should we care? Why should we take it seriously? If computer science provide other solution and other approximation, why shouldn't we take it, right? So there seems to be sort of a fight of epistemology here. And on top of that, you can add the epistemology that businessmen are pushing for, okay? What is tractability for business? What is simplicity for business? And does it change the kind of relationship between game theorists, experimentalists, and the identity of economists? So I'm done, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Béatrice. I suppose Eddie wants to respond to this.
I will, and thank you, Béatrice. But I should say that the initial provocation came some years ago, so of course I'm going to need some time to digest your wonderful comments. But I might have a thing or two to say about this. Why don't I jump in by talking about the different stories about the computer, because I'm happy to note that now there are only 2 stories. The last time that we talked, I had 3 stories, if I remember correctly, and now I've got it down to 2 stories. So if we project forward, then maybe there'll be a single story. But okay, of course, there can't be just one story if the topic is the computerization of economics and of the rest of society, because the computer's everywhere. The computer's everywhere. The computer's everywhere in economics. The computer is outside of economics. There's a story that one can tell about the computerization of business, and that's certainly been told. And so I'm kind of briefly tipping my cap to that story when I started to get into network computing and B2B commerce, but it's not something that I can do in a great deal of detail here. These different ways that computerization affected different branches of economics. Of course, I would argue that they're responding to similar trends. So it's not surprising that you would have the computer appear elsewhere within economics. I would say that to pick up with the last point about tractability as a concrete thing to focus on. Here is one place where you can see how it is, one concrete example of how it is that grappling with the computer changed things. So let's go back and talk about how it is that game theory enters into it. So this partially addresses your first question about the status of game theorists, where they came from, what they're doing, why they're changing, what they're responding to. I mean, we have to remember that game theory ends up getting enlisted into the design of markets almost as an accident. If you go back and you look at the history of the US FCC spectrum auctions, nobody would have thought that obviously game theory was the right place to go if you want to design a market. I mean, experimentalists had already been designing operational markets that use network computing by that time. Okay. How does game theory end up getting enlisted? Well, it's just an accident of what was published in the FCC dockets. Okay. So what they managed to do is kind of get ahead of things and present themselves as experts in the construction of markets. Of course, they couldn't do it. They had to ultimately call in experimentalists to build the market for the FCC spectrum auctions. And so you can sort of imagine that over time, there is a kind of a lesson that's learned there. And what we observe over time, if we just focus on game theorist participation in these events, is that they do bit by bit come around to the experimentalist way of looking at things. Okay. They build more detailed markets, ones that hadn't been treated before in the literature. They patent them, so they offer very specialized devices. Of course, they have to enlist expertise from computer science and those who are able to computerize things to help in doing so. And so, here I would say that that's an example of them sort of getting almost pushed toward the position that experimentalists had already occupied. Experimentalists had previously engaged with the computer in a serious way, and that sort of pushed them along to adopt the position that they took about what markets were supposed to accomplish. And so the story I'm telling is that it's kind of the same for game theorists. Okay, they get pushed along as well. Now, certainly that push involved businesses, because where else is the push going to come from? The push isn't going to come from, at that time, the military. It's going to come from in a new age of the sponsorship of science, different sorts of entities. And so it's hardly surprising, I would say, that businesses played a role there. So that's a big role that they play. They play a role in encouraging, let's say, game theorists to start to look a little bit more like experimental economics. Okay, so that would be addressing computers. That would be addressing the role of economists. Let's see. As to the different stories about the computer here, as I said before, I think that everything is kind of about the computer now. And so we can come in and we could tell a story about how information processing affected finance. They are responding to similar big trends. You can go into finance and you can observe similar trends at work. The removal of focus from individual agency toward talking about properties of markets themselves. And so now it's pretty routine not to have what you might call kind of a micro foundations of aggregate behavior in financial markets. So at that level, I mean, there's a similar story, I believe, that one can tell about what's happening with finance. In the specific case of Bitcoin, I mean, that story is not one that I've written and one that I would need to research more. It is interesting to see how quickly market designers have picked up on at least technologies like blockchain. And so blockchain ends up becoming the big thing for a person like Glenn Weil, for example. So surely that's a provocation that's worth thinking about and responding to. Finally,
to summarize, so you don't think that writing algorithm, or rather trying to forecast behavior or trying to find what causes behavior through sort of econometrics / machine learning techniques is kind of essentially different to you? It's the same.
Well, is that really what they're doing here? I mean, is that what's happening in the kind of research that's spawned by the platform firm, identifying causality and, coming up with theories about, I don't know, why it is the weather makes me do something? I'm not certain that is the story at all. I mean, that, it's a story of grabbing a bunch of data, and it's a story, that part of the story, that sub-story, that chapter of the story, let's say, involves a different way of thinking about what the purpose of data might be and what would count as a use for it. And so, yeah, I think that it moves away from that, actually. And tractability. Just to loop back around to where we started in your comments with tractability, and that interesting comment about computer scientists saying, well, why should we care about the game theoretic solution if it's not tractable? And I think that this was part of the fight between what I called the experimentalist view and the game theorist view before. I mean, if you're a game theorist, you have a model of agency, right? You have this model of agency. You are looking out on markets and treating them as these very stylized things. Even the thing that they call an English auction doesn't really fit what most of us think of when we think of the thing in the world called the English auction, right? So these start as highly stylized representations of a strategic situation. But it's not clear at all how that would work in some functional way when coded and when made to run. This was precisely why it is that in the case of those first FCC auctions, it was the experimentalists that had to be brought in to make the thing work. It's not clear at all how it is that a model of agent rationality lends itself to the construction of an operational market in all of its details, such that it will function, such that there will be a comprehensible user interface, and so on and so forth. And even at the level of theory, it's certainly not clear that people, well, it's clear that people will not be able to carry out the kinds of tasks that at least the canonical models suggested that they should be able to carry out. So yeah, I mean, that need to make the thing work and to actually deliver the goods, so to speak, absolutely, I would argue, ends up being one of the pushes in the story.
Thank you. Béatrice, do you want to respond to that?
Doing fine. I think we can open the floor.
Okay.
Should I
Thank
stop
you
sharing
both.
the screen? I'll stop sharing this. I'll get rid of the screen share. There we go.
Okay. So many thanks, Eddie and Béatrice, for agreeing to do this. Now we are going to move on to the audience questions and stop the recording.